It's National Signing Week at 24/7 Sports, and we are taking a look at the Ole Miss 2024 recruiting class, a top 25 class nationally, top 10 in the SEC, and Lane Kiffin securing talent in the Magnolia State. 5 of the top 10 players from Mississippi headed to Oxford. Cooper Petagna and Andrew Ivins from our national team joining me now to break down this class further. We will start with the highest rated player in the class, and that is 4-star Will Eccles. Two-way player on the line of scrimmage. You both saw him at the All-American game. Ivins, what's so impressive about him?
He's a guy that can play on both sides of the ball. Is he an offensive lineman or is he a defensive lineman? We needed an interior lineman for the AAB called Will Eccles. After he played defensive line at the Alabama-Mississippi All-Star game, he showed up and he was awesome. This is a guy that was Mr. Football in the state of Mississippi 4A, which you don't see for a guy in the trenches. I think he can rush the quarterback, create some protection in the middle, but if you needed him to play offensive line, at some point down the line, he could do it as well.
Yeah, model of consistency. When you think about Will Eccles, what he does, what he brings to that Ole Miss program, we went back and forth. We didn't know, is he an offense or defensive lineman? End of the day, he's a good football player. I think that's what matters. He showed up 2 settings. Hattiesburg at the Alabama-Mississippi All-Star game, then he showed up in San Antonio at the All-American Bowl. He was one of the most consistent players in both settings, and I think that's what Ole Miss is getting. They need to get better at the line of scrimmage, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I think the way that they were able to get Will Eccles in the door is that they convinced him that his future was playing defensive line. So I love the future. I love the pair there. If you're Ole Miss, you got to keep these caliber of players in state. Is a big get for Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin. I think this is a guy that can contribute rather quickly in Oxford as well.
Beefing up on defense was a point of emphasis for Lane Kiffin after that Georgia loss. He said something along the lines of, I want us to look good in our uniforms. Love the way our current players play, but size and length matter. And he's bringing in 2 4-star defensive linemen, Cam Franklin and Jeffrey Rush. So, Coop, what stands out to you about these two?
Well, I love what Pete Golding is doing, right? When it comes to Ole Miss, what do you think their identity is? It's offense, right? In that game against Georgia, it kind of showed where Ole Miss needs to take the next step. Where do they need to invest? Well, that's the defensive line. How do you do that? Well, you really got to do it through the high school lens because the transfer portal, it's a little bit oversaturated when it comes to point of attack players. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But they got it done with guys like Camarion Franklin, Jeffrey Rush, who didn't play this last year, but 2 guys that are from the state of Mississippi that were pivotal, right? And that's kind of the theme. Like, you have to be able to keep these players home in the Magnolia State whenever you have the opportunity. And guess what? You got to give them a lot of credit. Cam Beaver's another guy that we like a lot. Going to take a little bit longer to kind of develop into the frame. But if Ole Miss is going to be a contender when it comes to the college football playoff, and we all know they're kind of pushing all their chips to the middle of the table, it's really not going to be about offense. It's going to be, can they get it done on the defensive side of the ball? This recruiting class kind of showed where they needed to put their emphasis, and they did that.
4 of the state's top 4 ranked interior defensive linemen all headed to Ole Miss. That hasn't happened since Lane Kiffin has been there in Oxford. Think about it. Jaheim Otis, that's a kid that went to Alabama. You have McKinley Jackson, went to Texas A&M. They know where they needed to get better, and they're taking advantage of the current landscape in state, right? Mississippi State, some uncertainty of coaching changes. That opened the door for them to clean up. Alabama, they're going through a coaching change. And then Ole Miss is parlaying that on-field success into the recruiting class. We've seen them be active in the transfer portal. I think what's most impressive is just the investment in the prep ranks. If you think the transfer portal's free agency, well, they hit in their high school recruiting, which is the NFL draft. These are guys that all can be multi-year impact players in the SEC. Cooper, you mentioned Pete Golding. We know what he did when he was calling plays there in Tuscaloosa. Cam Beavers, to me, we really don't know what he is. Not a ton of verified information out there. You pair him with Camarion Franklin, who they beat Miami, plenty of others for. I mean, this unit it is going to allow that defense to get much better. We know they can score points. Now they're going to get some stops and get that offense back on the field.
Kiffin also had a late flip of A.J. Maddox from Texas A&M. Maddox talked about the success he's seen with Jackson Dart and how he wants to have a similar career path. Ivins, what's this mean for their quarterback room?
Well, I think he should be viewed as potentially the quarterback of the future there at Ole Miss. And they got another young arm that they really like in the building, Austin Simmons, a kid that jumped 2 classes. He was in the class of 2025 now, showed up this past summer as a 2023. I had no idea how he did it. But him and A.J. Maddox, I would assume, are going to duke it out at some point down the line. Are we going to see him on the field here in 2024? Probably not. But 2025, 2026, when Jackson Dart is gone, I think it's going to be A.J. Maddox versus Austin Simmons. Maddox, to me, Coop, we saw him at the Under Armour camp in Atlanta, kind of up and down performance there before his senior season. Well, he had a huge 12th grade campaign, led his team to its first ever state title, completed over 70% of his passes. He reminds me a little bit of, remember James Blackman at Florida State? I know you've brought this up in the past. I'm talking James Blackman when he was good for the Seminoles. I think they got similar builds. He can attack that deeper third. And most importantly, I think the arrow is pointing up. He is playing his best football right now, gets 2 years to potentially develop, and they get, let free in that offense.
Yeah, he's an ascending player, which Drew just touched on. I think that's the biggest thing. And another guy from the state of Mississippi that they flipped from an SEC rival in Texas A&M. So you think about that as well. That's another positive when you think about A.J. Maddox and what he brings to the table. But the other thing that Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin, should get a lot of credit for is how they've kind of developed this quarterback room. There is a ton of talent. You look past a guy like Jackson Dart, what does the future hold? What about Walker Howard, right? The transfer from LSU, another guy that was really highly touted. He hadn't even played yet, hadn't even stepped on the field. And then you talk about Austin Simmons, who reclassed. We talked about him a little bit earlier. Not all of these guys are going to end their career in Oxford, but at the end of the day, this is good to build a very competitive environment and see who wins out. And that's what you want. That's what you want to build. So Lane Kiffin, very quietly, I would say, over the last 2 years has taken advantage of the transfer portal, what he can bring, the type of talent that he can bring, not only to Oxford, but to that quarterback room specifically. This is very, in a very quick way, shifted to one of the best quarterback rooms, pound for pound, I think, talent-wise, in the country.
And I think what stands out about it, too, is they're not taking 2 quarterbacks a cycle, right? It seems like they'll get a veteran and then a high school guy. And Austin Simmons, in hindsight, when he reclassified, we're kind of scratching our head. What? This kid's jumping 2 years. He hasn't really played a ton of football. Now, when you take a step back and you look at, all right, A.J. Maddox is coming in. You mentioned the other transfers in there. I think Lane Kiffin's going to go after whoever's available in the transfer portal if it makes sense. It's creating a situation where the best man is going to win. And the other thing, if someone goes down, Jackson Dart gets hurt, you got some backups that can come in and be a pinch hitter and step in and win a game if you need to.
All right, well, you've both mentioned transfer portal, so let's get into that. Lane Kiffin is already the self-proclaimed king of the transfer portal. This year, he's dominating once again, signing the top class in this cycle, including the top player in the portal rankings in Walter Nolan. But Coop, how the Rebs recruit in the portal affect how they recruit the high school?
Well, they were one of 3 teams that took over 20 transfers last year in 2023 and won more than 10-plus games, right? So they have a different identity than everybody else. When everybody was zigging and zagging and recruiting the high school ranks was still the traditional way, Lane Kiffin was kind of dipping his toes in the portal and say, hey, we're at an unconventional spot at Ole Miss. We got to go up against the traditional powers of Alabama and Georgia. If we go head-to-head with these guys on the recruiting trail when it comes to the high school ranks, 8 out of 10 times we're probably going to lose that battle, right? So how do we overcome that? How do we overcompensate? Well, you have seen that. There have been a couple of programs out there that have taken advantage of the transfer portal NIL, and Lane Kiffin has really kind of showed the way of how to do that. Guys like Walter Nolan that went to Texas A&M, one of the best recruits in the country, the number 1 recruit in the country in 2022. You look at guys like Princewell Umanmielen, right, coming over from Florida, one of the best pass rushers in the country. You go down the list of what Ole Miss has done. Logan Diggs coming over from LSU. These are guys that they have a level of familiarity with. It's not a coincidence. I just listed off 3 guys from the SEC that these guys have done advanced scouting reports on when it comes to opponent scouts as well. So I think they've been very smart. I think they've been very intentional. And I think the other thing about Ole Miss is that they've shown this is what a program can do at a very high level if you are aligned top to bottom. And you got to give a lot of credit to Lane Kiffin for getting his ducks in a row with people outside that building saying, hey, we have an opportunity here in 2024 with Nick Saban out of the picture to run the table, win a national championship. Let's go all in. That's exactly what the Rebs appear to be doing.
That's what I was going to bring up, right? We saw what they did on the field in 2023, gearing up for a college football playoff run, going to 12 teams. using that transfer portal. I think Ole Miss can kind of be like Florida State and Mike Norvell. Remember, a lot of used parts went into the Seminoles' magical undefeated regular season, and they were able to parlay that on-field success into one of their best recruiting classes in a long time. I know it kind of fell apart down the stretch. I'm excited to see what Ole Miss is able to do in the recruiting ranks in 2025. I think the opportunity is going to be that you're going to be playing in the national spotlight. You're going to be on the preseason magazines. Everyone is going to be talking about Ole Miss, right? So you use the transfers to get here. They're still going to be in the transfer portal, but they can capitalize on the recruiting front because a lot of eyes are going to be on Ole Miss football this fall.
And now that the playoff is expanding to 12 teams, it's wide open for teams like Ole Miss to jump in there. All right, Coop and Ivins, thanks so much. And for more Ole Miss football and recruiting news, check out InsideTheRebels.com. Our team site experts over in Oxford have you covered from signing day to the postseason and everything in between. That's InsideTheRebels.com.